Okay, I'd like to extend the warmest welcome to Ian Timbrell, who is a formidable human being. Just by way of introduction, before I allow him to say anything in introduction of himself, I want to point out that he's an experienced educator, leader, and consultant who supports schools, colleges, and businesses to improve their LGBTQ plus inclusion policies, procedures, and provision. He provides staff training and consultation, as well as workshops for young people, as well as running the podcast Staff Room Soapbox. And he's currently writing his first book on effective leadership. Now, that's a lot, Ian. Is there anything you need to add to that bio?
You can tell I like to keep busy, and out of trouble. But yeah, no, that pretty much sums up my life. I think, and obviously we're going to talk about RSE today. And the interesting thing about RSE was when I was deciding what my future career was going to be, it was never the plan. So, and I sort of fell into it. Now it's something I absolutely love doing. So, but no, that pretty much sums up my life, apart from running around after a 10-year-old who, keeps me on my toes because is as big trouble as I am. So, yeah, we're a good pair.
Absolutely. And it's a vital piece of information, parent as well as all of those other things. I don't quite know how you have time to fit it all in, to be honest.
Who
Um,
needs sleep, Bennett? Who needs sleep?
Who needs
Oh,
sleep? Who needs sleep? So, I wanted to give you an opportunity just to talk about yourself for a little while because you've come to this work. We're going to be talking about age appropriate RSE, but I recognize there's lots of elements of you that you're bringing to this work. So, the question I'm asking is, who are you and how did you come to it?
yeah, so let's go right back to the beginning, to when I was in school, because I think what I find interesting about this work is one of the most important phrases that I realized that we don't talk about enough is you don't know what you don't know. So I went into teaching actually quite late. I was 25 when I went into teaching. And but my experience of RSE, LGBT inclusion, sex ed, all these things was when I was in secondary school. We were in year 7, and all of the girls were called into the hall for an hour, and the boys had an extra hour playtime, and we never found out what happened. You can imagine, can't you, the rumors? The rumors that went round about what happened in that hour were hilarious looking back. But that was it. Apart from a bit in biology of actually conception and birth, that's not helpful. Apart from that, there was nothing. There was nothing on relationships. So when I started teaching, actually, when I think back to my first probably 10 years of teaching in primary, we didn't do RSE. We didn't really do it in the way that we think about it now. We did friendships. And that was pretty much it. We did PSE to do with friendships. And I taught for about 10 years in my first school. And I actually loved it. It was an incredibly high performing school. But everything was based on friendships, and it was very ad hoc. So it
Mm,
was very, oh, there's something going on in the school. Let's react to it.
right.
Let's sort of do something about that. Let's do our PSE lessons, circle time around that. Then, summer term, 3 weeks before the end of summer term in year 6, the nurse would come in and do the puberty talk that no one else wanted to do. And that was it. So that was my sort of experience of all these things. And I loved being a teacher in this school. It was absolutely great. And then I realized that I wanted to do more things. So randomly, I became the IT advisor for the local authority, actually
Okay.
for 4 local authorities. And I gave a presentation on effective ICT, and I was asked to be the advisor. And I did that for a year. My initials also incidentally ICT. So,
Convenient.
it was natural.
Yeah.
But that was my first experience of really training people
Right.
and working with the wider school context. And I absolutely loved it. I then adopted my son. And so I finished that role. It was a secondment. And when I went back to school, I knew I wanted more. So I started looking for deputy head jobs. And I was very fortunate to get a deputy head job in a school that was an incredible challenge. So I went
Mm,
from a school that was one of the top performing schools in Wales to one, let's just say, that was not.
bless.
And it was really challenging. We had to completely redevelop our curriculum through COVID,
Right.
which, trying to do that when you're not face to face with the children was really hard. But we were adamant, the head and I, that we weren't going to stop school improvement because of the pandemic. And then it sort of dawned on me. So Wales introduced its RSE framework in 2019
Mm.
that we don't do RSE. We don't really do PSE very well in primary schools. We do friendships and the odd puberty talk. Actually, there's loads and loads missing. And I started to read up on it. And all of a sudden, I had this fascination with
Yeah,
RSE. I loved it. I thought, actually, this is the stuff that I didn't have. But it's that thing I said earlier, but you don't know what you don't know. So
yeah.
I didn't know that this stuff was missing from me teaching because I didn't have it in my education. And then I had a few unfortunate instances in school
Mm.
where I had a pupil who refused to come to school for 2 months because I was gay.
Wow.
And there was no support from the local authority at all. It was dreadful. Not one person in the local authority ever picked up the phone to check how I was, even an email, nothing. My head was amazing, my school were amazing.
Yeah.
But it made me realize that actually there's a lot of work to do in this area. So I decided to leave education. So I left school in January 2023,
Yeah.
which seems like, in one way, an eternity ago, and in another way, seems to have just happened. But as I was sort of developing my LGBT courses, I realized how intertwined it was with RSE.
Mm.
You can't really do one without the other because if you're talking about relationships and sex, you
Mm.
have to talk about sexuality and gender. They're so intertwined. And so I signed myself up for a course with Asset UK to become an accredited RSE trainer. And I
Wow.
did it and I loved it. And I now, go into schools training on RSE. I do workshops with young people, and it's one of the most fun parts of my job.
It's incredible to think how many of those formative experiences have brought you to where you are. But fundamentally, recognizing that gap seems really, really seminal in terms of creating this pathway for yourself. And I'm interested to you talked about then, what's the context now? Do we still have this gap? What's happening with RSE, particularly in primary schools, particularly around LGBT identities and gender and sexuality?
So the first thing to say is we are in a far better place, because basically you have to be from about 20 years ago where some schools had nothing. So, we are definitely in the right place. However, it's still not good enough.
Mm.
And so the Sex Education Forum do a young person's poll every year. And in England last year, only 40% of students said that RSE was good or better. So we're not even
Wow.
talking about outstanding, we're talking about good. So that means 60% of the education isn't good enough. Now, if that was English or maths, there would be a national strategy to
Yeah.
sort it. That's not what's happening with RSE. Instead, we've got people using it as a political football
Mm.
and a way of attacking rights. And it's become this area where people are afraid to talk about it.
Mm.
And even though I go into schools almost every day and I see amazing work going on in schools, but people are afraid to talk about it publicly. If anyone follows me on Twitter, you'll see regularly that I'm attacked by trolls with the most vicious, horrible things. So no wonder schools don't talk about it publicly because they are afraid of the backlash over education that our young people need.
Mm.
So what I'd say to people is there is amazing work going on. Just because people aren't talking about it much publicly, it is. But there is still massive room for improvement.
Mm.
When
Mm.
we talk about LGBT inclusion in there, it is still in its infancy. And it's
Mm.
that thing, if you don't know what you don't know again, many of these teachers don't know what it's like to be LGBT. So if they haven't got the resources, how are they going to teach it? Even myself, I've got an accreditation in RSC, I've done all the
Yeah.
research. I have my limited experience as well. So I have to make sure that if I'm going in and delivering any of these activities, that I'm making sure that I'm doing my research in advance.
And it's so important because of that fear that people have. They're looking for an expert, they're looking for someone who has done the research, they're looking for someone who is really rooted in the statutory information about RSE. And because I know that you do this a lot, I know you will have these answers. What are the key things that teachers need to be aware of in terms of the law, the statutory information about RSE with a lens on LGBTQ plus?
I mean, so the first thing to really understand, which is often missed, is that it's different for all four nations.
Okay.
So we often see particularly in the media, talk about RSE, and actually what it's talking about is RSE in England. So the landscape is very different depending on which nation you are. So the most extreme example is in Wales, where
Mm.
it is statutory for all pupils and there is no opt-out. So in
Right.
Wales, pupils cannot be pulled out of any part of RSE for any reason, including sex education.
Mm.
That doesn't mean that all pupils have the same education. So pupils, particularly with trauma or additional learning needs, may have it in a different way, at a different time scale, using different resources. But that is, in Wales, everyone has to have RSE no matter what.
Mm. Mm.
The other nations have opt-outs of certain parts. So, for example, England has it opt-out of only sex education. Now, that doesn't include LGBT inclusion. And
Ah,
that's
okay.
really important. People get that mixed up quite often, saying, I've got parents requesting for withdrawal because we're talking about gay people, role models, two families. There is no opt-out of that. It is only the sex part that people have that opt-out. So that, apart from those bits, it is statutory that all pupils should be having age and stage appropriate RSE.
Okay. And so, when you hear the kind of political wranglings about this, is it true to say that teachers should really just go by the law when it comes to this work?
I would say yes. I think we have to be incredibly careful about this. This is there's a lot in the media about saying about these third-party companies that are doing
Yeah.
RSE, and I think actually a lot of them bring really important works to schools. Schools cannot be specialists in everything.
No.
There's absolutely no way. So, for example, if I want to do lessons on toxic masculinity or consent or something like that, actually, there's some amazing organizations that do it really, really well. But as school, what your responsibility is to challenge these organizations and check that they are working within the law as well. We can't have organizations going rogue. It's really important. Personally, I actually support that there should be an accreditation process for any organizations going into school. I would
Right.
actually welcome that personally. I think we can't mess around with sex education in particular. And
Mm.
I would welcome that. And it's something that I'm campaigning with the Welsh government at the moment to bring that in, because I believe that there are some amazing third party
Yeah.
charities, organizations. However, we have to safeguard them, the schools, and the pupils by making sure that what they're delivering is within the confines of RSE and the law.
Absolutely. I think that's a really interesting angle to take. And certainly in terms of safeguarding, in terms of kind of quality assurance, that would be a bit of a no-brainer. You talked a little bit about, kind of that not being able to be the expert in everything. But of course, teachers are often time poor, they work with the resources that they've got. So if you had to give advice about either setting up an RSE curriculum or adapting an RSE curriculum that is age appropriate for young people, what principles would you use?
So the Sex Education Forum has 12 principles of RSE. And I would recommend that every school takes a look at these. That they're really, really useful. And they go through all of those principles. So there's things like ensuring that the resources are high quality, the statistics are accurate, that the staff are highly trained, and that we use pupil voice, that actually the young people, to a certain extent, know what they want
Mm.
and what they need. And if we're not listening to them, then we're not giving them an education that they need. But I mean, the starting point I would say is to make sure that you're clear in your school with the vision. So, if let's flip this conversation. If we were talking about English and we want
Mm.
to develop an English curriculum, the first thing you'd be talking about is purpose and why we have it.
Yeah.
This is no different. And for some reason, when it comes to RSE, that bit's sort of forgotten. If we think of the Simon Sinek, model of why at the corner, why is this RSE important to our school and our young people? If our staff aren't clear on that, why it's
Mm.
important, it's either going to be shoved to the side or it's going to be low quality. It's going to be one of those things that gets dropped immediately because someone's off sick. We need to be really clear as a whole staff about why RSE is
Mm.
important for our young people. And then we need to make sure that we're clear on exactly what quality RSE is. The funny thing is, it's the same as every other subject. Good teaching and learning is good teaching and learning. It's
Yeah.
not worksheets. Worksheets have their place, but every lesson shouldn't be a worksheet. If we're looking at videos, we would want to make sure that they're high quality, that they're relevant, that they're recent. So all the things you would do in any other subject that make good quality teaching and learning
Mm,
apply to RSE. And then we need to think about, how we do the age appropriateness, how we
mm,
go through each, what's our journey in the school that they go through, rather than plonking a lesson of, right, we're going to teach consent in year 8. Well, actually, what did they learn in year 7 and what are they going to learn in year 9? Is there a flow of curriculum? And
mm,
there are some curricula out there that are created. There are some private ones that you can buy. And I would suggest sometimes if you've got nothing in school, they're a good starting point. But you need to use those and go back to your why and make them
mm.
your own. Make them right for your pupils and your school. And if you haven't done that first bit, that why, then the rest is just, it's going to be very tick boxy.
Yeah. And I'm interested in the the assertion that it's just like any other subject, when actually there are some real pitfalls and tricky areas to navigate. So you've talked a little bit about sexuality, but what are the tricky areas when it comes to age appropriate RSE?
I mean, when we're talking about primary school, um, generally we talk about puberty. When on earth do you introduce the talk about puberty? There's huge debate because none of the RSE curricula say this date,
Mm,
year 4 or year 5, year 6. They all roughly say key stage 2, it should be introduced. And actually, that is the way it should be because we all know that every cohort is different, every class is different, every year group is different. And actually, sometimes you might need it earlier or later, depending on the individual cohort. But that puberty talk, people are really afraid of it. And what they do is they do it once and never again. Well, actually, no, again, thinking about what's good teaching and learning, you wouldn't do
yeah,
that with any other topic. So why would we do it with puberty? We need to give those children a chance to learn about it, to digest it, to reflect on it, and come back to it. So leaving it till 2 weeks before the end of the summer term is
yeah,
just poor practice. We need that time for the children to understand it, particularly children with special educational needs and additional learning needs. They particularly need time to digest this information and reflect on it. It's really, really important. So in primary, that's mainly the tricky area. There's
yeah,
also the discussion about when we talk about LGBT inclusion,
yeah.
but when do you introduce it all? It's one of the most common questions I get from people is when do you start introducing it? As if I go, it's on day 73 of year 1 is when you say this. If I could do that, I'd make a fortune, I'm sure. If I could produce this magical formula for when it's not good. You have to do what's right for your school. You
Yeah.
have to go what's age appropriate. One of the examples I give is the difference between teaching something and representation.
Mm,
So there should be representation of same-sex couples, of single parents, of adopted
right.
and fostered, right from day one. Mixed race families, disabilities. They should be seeing families of all types from day one. But actually, the consideration we need to think is when do they need the language around it? So the example I give is my son who learned the word gay when he was 8, and
Right.
he has 2 dads. He didn't need that word beforehand. That's not to say I avoided it
Mm,
but he understood the concept of 2 men could love each other without the word. And I think some
right.
people fret about we have to introduce those words really early on, whereas
Mm,
actually we need to do it when it's meaningful to them. And for most children, to be honest, it's about year 2 or year 3. Before that point, the thing that they need to know is that there's different types of families and different types of
yeah.
relationships. But again, I'd come back to rather than going, ooh, what's everyone else doing? What's right for your children and your school? And be very clear on why you're introducing it. And actually, it's quite different in secondary schools.
Yeah.
Secondary schools are actually quite good at that stuff. They're quite good at the vocabulary. They're quite good at sex ed. It's much more straightforward, but also they've been doing it for a far longer time. The pitfalls in secondary schools are the complex issues like consent.
Right.
Consent is such a complex issue. And I
Mm,
remember when I started this work, someone posted a tweet that said, consent is simple. It's just yes or no. And it is absolutely not.
right.
Let's say, for instance, you and I met and I went to give you a hug. I don't say to you, may I give you a hug, please? And you go, yes, you may. But no one does that. You put out your arms, don't you? And you assess the other person's body language and then you know whether or not. And also you know that person, whether they're
Yeah.
a. So consent is not as simple as saying yes or no. And so these are the issues in secondary school. And what sometimes happens is resources are produced where, for example, a scenario is given and there's one correct answer.
Mm,
That's not real life.
no.
These things are really complex. And actually, what we need to build in secondary school is more of a discussion model with RSE, whereas we open things up to discussion where we understand that there's different viewpoints, that
Yeah.
we might at the end of the lesson not come to a complete agreement, and
Yeah.
that's okay. But I think there's a stress that teachers have that, like, the success criteria that everyone has to agree by the end of the lesson, everyone has to say the same thing, and that's a huge pitfall.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what you tend to get then is young people who just parrot stuff back at you because it's what you need to hear so they can get out of the lesson. Whereas
Yeah.
actually, life is complicated. Let's not simplify it down to the point, like.
Yeah, yeah. But I like that distinction. I think lots of people would assume that the pitfalls at primary are the pitfalls at secondary, but those tricky areas can be entirely affected by the age of the pupils. And I'm conscious that our listeners will be thinking about that age appropriate label. Because coming back to something you said, it's always, when do you introduce the idea of LGBT identities? When did you introduce the idea of gender? How do we have appropriate representation in schools? So my question is, what are the things to look out for? Should we be, sticking to a central list of books? Should we have a scheme of work to follow that everybody follows? What does age appropriate actually look like in practice?
Now, I am going to be quite controversial. I hate the term age
Ah,
appropriate.
okay.
Uh, and I am quite open about that. I have met the Minister of Education for Wales and have told him that. I think it's a complete misnomer.
Okay.
There is no such thing as age appropriate in my eyes, because that
Okay.
makes the assumption that every child is at age 7 can
Mm.
do this. I far prefer the term stage appropriate,
Right. Okay.
which takes into account a lot more things. So it does take into account their age, because roughly the same time most children will go through puberty. But
Mm.
actually, the other things that we need to consider then are additional learning needs.
Yep.
If they have autism, there are considerations we have to make, things like cerebral palsy, what are the things need, but also their background.
Yep.
So a child of trauma, a child who's witnessed domestic violence will need very different approaches
Mm.
to a child that hasn't. And so, yeah, I find it remarkable that all the curricula in the UK say age appropriate. And I think that has caused problems in schools, because what you now have is, in year 3, we do this.
Mm.
I think that's fine to have. I think it's okay for schools to say, right, in year 3, this is our coverage for the majority of our pupils.
Yeah.
But we mustn't be afraid, in essence, of differentiation, isn't it? It's
Mm.
going to actually, rather than looking at their academic selves, what we're looking at is their additional learning needs or their experiences, to actually go, one, should they be having it in this place? Also, should they be having it with the other children? Should they be having the same resources? I was working with a SEND school a couple of weeks ago, and it was a wonderful experience. And they said about when they were learning about contraception,
Yeah.
and there was a penis model that came out, not a person, as in uh,
Okay.
before,
That's a
before
relief.
people go, oh my gosh, there's a, yeah. So a model of a penis, I should say, that was
Yeah.
bright blue.
Right.
And it's one that's commonly given from the NHS. And I had a really good discussion with these SEND pupils. And what they said is, I think that's fine. For me, that's helpful. But they said, but some of my friends need to see one that is exactly real, because otherwise they will think that it's blue. And so even within SEND provision and ALN provision, we can't treat all pupils the same. And
Yeah.
it does present a challenge for schools. And what you have to do is you have to know your pupils really well. You
Yeah.
have to go, yes, as a school, we can map out roughly where things should be. However, it's about knowing your children,
Mm.
knowing what they need, so we can make those adjustments so that the RSE is right for them.
I love that. The idea of stage appropriate rather than age appropriate, because you're right, children aren't a homogenous unit. And one 6-year-old compared to another 6-year-old might be in completely different places, completely different experiences, and will experience RSE in a completely different way. I'm conscious that, there's a kind of real need to for people to feel like they can get this right. And quite often I'm asked, who is doing it right? Have we got models out there of places that have just, got a really great approach? And I thought you might have some ideas as to who that might be.
And this is a real challenge because
Mm,
I asked that question when I started this job, because as part of my training, my idea was going to be that I put up case studies from schools and go, this school are doing it really well, and these are the things they did. It is nigh on impossible to find.
right,
And I think that, and the ones that I have found generally are pre-pandemic. And the only thing I can think the reason is that schools are afraid of being publicly just talking about RSE because you don't want to be on the front page of certain newspapers.
right.
And I think that that has caused a problem. However, that doesn't mean there aren't resources. So while it is very difficult to find case studies for individual schools,
Mm,
if the PSHE Association, the Sex Education Forum have some absolutely amazing surveys on there which look at multiple schools. So they actually, although they're not looking at individuals, they
mm,
look at schools across the country and give us a general overview. But also many local authorities actually have some really amazing work as well. So
mm,
Derbyshire Local Authority have something called the BERT Award, and it's an award where people can apply if they're working really well with RSE, but they also have
okay.
lots of case studies on there. And I'm sure that even outside Derbyshire, contacting them about some good practice, they'd be able to. And I think we just need to talk to each other more about
Mm,
it. But yeah, unfortunately, we are in a situation where schools don't want to put them in a vulnerable position by publicising their RSE, which is a really sad
it's terrible.
state. But unfortunately, it is the reality.
It's the reality, yeah.
It's that I'm messaged regularly about going into schools to work with RSE, and I no longer post on Twitter where I'm going, because I want to safeguard the school. And again, that's a really sad place to be, but we have to live in the reality we live in. But I would just recommend, yeah, people look at the PSHE Association and the Sex Education Forum for some really amazing resources.
Yeah, and I think knowing that you're not alone, knowing that there are other organizations out there that are supportive and have produced things in line with statutory guidance, really thinking about some of those nuances, that makes us feel like, we can do this work, because sometimes we just need a model. And a big shout out to Derbyshire. I'm a Derby City dweller, but Derbyshire is on my doorstep. So the Burt Award is something to look out for. And it's certainly something that I've noticed in any kind of diverse education, in fact, where people are afraid to bring their resources forward and say, look, this is what we're doing, for fear of getting into that news media landscape. And, this is a kind of an add-on question here. What role does the media play in kind of preventing really good work here? Is it a real problem for teachers?
Oh, it's huge. So several years ago, a group of parents took the Welsh government to court to ban RSE in Wales, and actually went to the High Court,
Wow.
and they lost, because of some of the claims they made that simply weren't true. That group continues to campaign against, against RSE. I find it baffling that anyone can
Mm-mm.
campaign against the whole of RSE. When you look at, the foundation phase and foundation stage, most of it's about friendships, hygiene, table manners.
Yeah,
I'm like, what? Who doesn't want those things taught in schools?
yeah.
That's not what they mean. That's not what these groups are campaigning about. And very quickly, you see through them that actually
Mm,
what they're going for is they want to get rid of LGBT inclusion. They want to get rid of talking about racial diversity
yeah.
and religions, and they want to get rid of sex ed.
Mm,
But to publicly say that would lose a lot of followers. So that's why lots of these organizations go down the route of banning RSE.
mm, mm.
But what they're very good at doing, these organizations, is finding scaremonger stories and twisting them.
Yeah.
And they make great headlines. So, we had the story in the Isle of Wight last year of a drag queen who supposedly was talking about, 100 genders, and shut down people. And it was on the front page of newspapers, and it was
Mm,
a furore on social media. Isle of Wight Council went and investigated it. and it was all nothing. It was literally came from one parent who had stretched the truth so far. And I think the media are doing these stories because they get clicks,
Mm.
they do, but they don't then report on when it's found to be nothing. So all of these cases that we've seen in the media where there have been these scare stories have got loads of clicks, but then always found to be completely baseless. But
Yeah.
that's never reported. And so what happens is you get these bank of false stories build up with these organizations, but they never put the retractions, they never put the truth. Um,
No, it's that kind of snowball effect, isn't it?
mm,
About, one small thing turns into a big story. It's blown up, and people only ever remember the big story. They don't remember that it was disproven or found to be baseless. And I think that's where the real fear comes in, stepping outside of the box with RSE, or saying, actually, this is what we believe in, because of that fear. And unfortunately, I think RSE gets caught in the culture wars, which, I'm sure you've noticed, as a real issue. You know, there are history gets caught up in it, English gets caught up in it, and I think RSE gets caught up in it, unfortunately.
it
Uh,
does. I've seen the things that have been said are horrendous. I mean, the organisation that did a protest about me outside the Welsh government, the Senedd building, about a
mm,
year ago, and it was horrible, knowing that they were going to go out. Actually, when the actual protest happened, I could only but laugh because their main complaint was that I wore heels once in school. It was laughable. However, the vitriol that surrounded it, what they did is drew in this hate from
yeah.
other groups, and that's what I it's now walked off a duck's back for me because I
Mm,
know it's all evidence less. They're just doing it for an agenda. But there are other people who it really hurts, and I think the
yeah,
media
yeah.
has a responsibility to fact check these stories before that they publish them.
It strikes me that actually it's so rooted in a kind of quite ludicrous fear, isn't it? Because, if we do teach about sexuality or gender, or, wear high heels in school, that somehow that will determine a child's gender, sexuality, fashion preferences as they grow older. Um, uh, is that something that you're conscious of? That this is what it's rooted in?
I mean, I was so the line I always give back to that, which bigots hate. It's great.
Yeah.
I say, look, I have been. I hate the fact that our society is just full of straight people, and all I see is straight people on TV and straight people in books. One day I'm going to get converted to being straight. And but it's ludicrous. It is
Yeah, yeah,
absolutely from a place where it's a lack of understanding.
yeah.
You can't convert someone like that. That is absolutely not true.
No.
And yeah, we need to make sure that although we have this stuff is going on, it is such a tiny proportion of people.
Yeah.
You know, we haven't got mass walkouts of schools. We haven't got mass protests. Schools haven't been shut down because of these things. They are very, very loud voices from a
Mm.
tiny, tiny majority.
Yeah,
And we need to remember that we cannot let them detract from giving our young people effective RSE because they deserve our help to make sure they grow into happy and healthy adults.
absolutely. It can feel like quite a loud voice though, and it's the frightening voice that I think people really balk at. Um, I'm conscious that, in your visiting of lots of different schools, you've seen some really positive approaches. Um, people will often say, we don't want to make a loud noise about our RSE curriculum because parents might object or the community might object, especially when there's religion involved. How do you navigate that space where, you have groups of people who've got very, very strong entrenched views, bringing this to school and saying to teachers, I don't believe you shouldn't. That's my job. Actually, I'm not, I don't agree with. How do you deal with that?
The first thing I say is, everything in your school should come from your values. Those children are in your school, and it is our responsibility to deliver an education that aligns with our values.
Mm,
And making sure that that is communicated to the parents. And most schools have a value or a statement around inclusivity, and making clear to the parents that this is the reason we do it. But it's about engaging with the parents, and it's about engaging with the community, and actually speaking to them about what their concerns are, listening to them, asking them, but also working to a point where I think sometimes we think I got to do it all now. Whereas that, I was at a school very recently where they admitted that they had never done sex ed. It was a very
mm,
high population, Muslim population. And I said, look, if you go in like a bullet a gate, like a ton of bricks, just introduce it all without the community, it is going to be a disaster.
mm,
I said to them, have a 5-year plan. Think about now, what are you going to incrementally introduce over the next 5 years? So that not only are your children coming along with you, but so are your parents, and you
mm,
can engage with them at every stage. The vast majority of parents, regardless of culture or religion, will come along with you if you engage with them and if you show them that it's a gradual process. But also key to it is why you're doing it.
mm,
Now, you will always get those parents who won't come along with you. And it is simple as it is a zero tolerance. If it's to do with LGBT inclusivity, for example, there is no opt-out in any curriculum in the UK.
mm,
This is our school policy. This is why we do it. It reflects British society. You have to, unfortunately, take a stand with those individual parents. Or you offer the opt-out. If it's sex ed, you offer that opt-out. It's not, in England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, that option is there.
mm,
It is there for a reason. But I think, yeah, it's starting the main thing. 99.9% of parents will come along with you if you involve them, if you work with them,
yeah.
um, and if recognize that they're probably going on a journey as well.
Yeah, because that idea of learning together,
Mm.
and developing education really holistically around family, communities, and young people is something that I think we often forget in schools. And when we're dealing with fear in particular around what is my child going to learn, how will that affect them? That's something that actually does need a kind of incremental, slowly approach within the confines of the law. And I would also point out that, we have Inequality Act and we have British values. We can
Yeah.
couch this work in those things. And most schools will say that they are, supporters of those documents. So we've talked a little bit about objections. I want to think about kind of takeaways, and how you would like to leave your audience really kind of thinking about what's next. Because we can often talk and plot out the landscape, but we won't necessarily have tangible ways forward. So if you had to think of 3 really positive ways forward to take away from either your experience or your understanding of the law, or your training, what would you say?
So I'm not going to tell you what I think. I'm going to tell you what young people think.
Okay.
I was recently working with a group of 5 schools, including a SEND school. We've been on a 6-month project where we're going to be producing a pack for teachers on what young people want from RSE. So I'm not going to tell you what I think as an adult because, I'm way past it. I'm over 40 now, according to teenagers. I'm, over the hill now. So I'm going to tell you what they said. And the main things that they said were, first of all, the teachers teaching RSE should be want to teaching it, and they should be highly trained. They know if a teacher does not want to be teaching RSE, and they say the problem with doing that is we will not open up. So your teachers teaching RSE need to be enthusiastic and they
Yeah.
need to be highly trained. The second thing I would say is when we asked them what they wanted to learn about, everything that they wanted to learn about was in RSE, but it's the things that schools avoid. So
Right.
it's the things like ensuring that sex ed is LGBT inclusive. That doesn't mean having the gay lesson, but that just means when you're teaching about contraception, that you're acknowledging that, for instance, that a condom can also be used for anal sex.
Mm,
Making sure that, and things like pornography,
mm, mm.
a third of 13-year-olds will now have seen pornography, which is a terrifying
Wow.
statistic. If we don't teach about it in schools, how are they going to learn, why pornography is unhealthy? So we need to
Mm,
make
mm.
sure that we're not avoiding those subjects. And the final thing
Yeah.
is we need to make sure it's a priority. It is one of the most important things that we can teach in schools. Our generation know what the lack of it, the
Yeah.
damage it can do. Let's not let down our young people. Let's make sure that we give them high quality RSE so they can grow up to be happy, healthy adults.
I mean, those 3 points are just so incredibly concise, but they've also triggered a whole load of questions for me. So I apologize, Ian. I'm not going to let you go yet. Um, I wanted to go back to that point about highly trained RSE teachers. And it occurred to me while you were talking that I was asked to deliver sex education to my form group in my first years of teaching. How common is that? Is that still the case? Do we have a rising population of highly trained RSE teachers, or is just not is that not happening?
It's too common. Let's just
Right.
put it that way. It is still happening. It is too common. Certain teachers, those who tend not to have full timetables, tend to be given it. And quite frankly, you're putting the teacher and the young people at risk.
Mm,
And I'm not sugarcoating it. Like, you are putting people at risk. Because that teacher is at risk, because if they give information, for example, around consent that is not accurate, and then someone goes on to do something
yeah.
because of what they've heard in that lesson, that teacher could be implicated in that. And so
Mm,
they need to have that training to understand. Well, but also they may be sharing misconceptions, stereotypes, which are all really damaging. So,
mm.
it is way too common. There's some amazing courses out there. There are absolutely loads on the Sex Education Forum, PSC
Mm.
Association, Asset UK. They are really available. There's no reason, absolutely no reason why people delivering RSC shouldn't be trained. And there's lots of free ones available. So if you look at Brook, for example, they
Mm.
have loads of free courses on sex ed. But so it doesn't even have to cost the school any money. So money is not an argument with this.
Yeah, yeah,
But it shouldn't be on the teacher to train themselves. It should be a priority. If the school decides someone's delivering RSE, particularly around those sensitive areas such as
yeah.
pornography, consent, sex, then they need to have that training because it's safeguarding in my eyes.
Yeah, and now looking back, it seems almost ludicrous that I was asked to deliver that. And teachers will abide by a scheme of work, but I recognize now, listening to you, that actually I was entirely clueless. And I was getting questions that I was kind of fielding answers and developing answers as I was talking, as opposed to having thought it through. And that I imagine is the case still in some schools. And as a former timetabler, I am aware that, if you're light on timetable, you might get put into humanities where you might have some ability to deliver. Um, Thank you for that. I was going to go back to that point on pornography because we haven't touched on that. And a kind of pornography and age appropriate seems like an interesting area to explore because it's so, like you said, with that statistic, it's so prevalent in our society. How much impact is it having on children's understanding of relationships and sex?
Yes, there's big discussions at the moment, particularly around strangling and choking,
Right, okay.
because it's quite prevalent in pornography, and there's quite a lot of studies being done at the moment, and there seems to be a rising view that that choking and strangling is sort of like a mainstream part of sexual intercourse.
Wow,
Now,
okay.
I am not going to say that people shouldn't do choking and strangling. It's not for me to dictate what adults do, what two consenting adults do. That is completely up to them. But I think we have to be careful of saying that that is the expectation. Now,
Mm,
that's the problem with pornography, is that it gives expectations of what sex is like for most of society.
mm,
Actually, it's not. Particularly women in pornography tend to be very submissive,
mm, mm,
very passive, and really is putting all the power with the man.
mm, mm,
And that's very concerning because it's concerning that pornography gives the message that women should be passive, but also
mm.
men should be dominant.
Yeah, yeah.
That is a very dangerous dynamic to introduce to young people. And said, some people enjoy the submissive and dominant role, and that's absolutely fine. But they have to be consenting and be informed with it
Mm.
and understand that that is not the expectation of sex. That is a
Yeah,
choice
yeah.
that you make. And that's the problem with pornography. It just doesn't represent real life.
And thinking about kind of when pornography is spoken about in schools, is it coming at the right time?
It's really challenging because, as I said, a third of pupils around the age of 13 have
Mm.
seen it. So there's an argument, some people say, well, we should teach it at 12 then. But you have two-thirds who have never seen it
Right.
and
Okay.
may not be ready. Particularly because that might be the first time they've ever seen anything to do with sexual intercourse, because
Mm, mm.
generally you don't teach sexual intercourse in primary school. It's very, very rare that it is. It's very rare in year 7. It's normally about year 8 or year 9.
Yeah.
We want the first time that they see sex to be porn. But that's not a good thing, and so there is no right answer of when you should do it. There are various debates that are going on. Personally, again, I would be speaking to your community, speaking to the parents. It may be that you decide to do it with small groups if you know that there's an
Mm,
issue
mm.
with small groups. I'd love to say that it was as simple as just do it this age.
Yeah, yeah.
There is no easy answer. And I think whatever age you do it at, there's going to be pros and cons of doing it. And so I think as a school, you just have to weigh that up.
Yeah, yeah.
And coming up that why. If a parent asks you, why are you delivering this in year 9? You have very, very clear evidence-based reasons why you're delivering it then.
Yeah, it's so tricky kind of thinking about, making sure that children are aware of the dangers of something they might be viewing already, but balancing that with young people who may have no idea about it. And how much of an issue are we creating? And that's a hard space to navigate. But like you said, rooting it in values, talking to your parents and your communities, ensuring that you've got the rationale for it, that's the key in all of this. But yeah, I'm very glad in some ways that I was an English teacher, not an RSE teacher. Although in saying that, we had objections to books. Don't
Yeah.
teach about witches, don't teach about the supernatural on religious grounds. So there is some crossover there.
But I think
Um,
it comes back to my point about the people delivering RSE need to be enthusiastic about it and they
yeah,
need to be
yeah.
trained. Because for them, like I'm happy to have these conversations with parents. I love teaching RSE. I've got the statistical background to be able to justify all of these things
Yeah.
in my school, my context, and that's what's really important. It can't fall, and there's people who are doing it because they've got
Mm,
a free hour.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
it's just it's not protecting the pupils, the teacher, or the school.
Such an important point to finish on. Ian, thank you so much for today. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, and there's possibly words in this interview that I wasn't expecting to hear. But I think, we've really kind of shown some of the detail of the work. If you'd like to catch up with Ian's work, please do follow him on X, and he is able to be found at Timbrell Education and at Diverse Educators. He is a wonderful trainer and a real asset to any training program for schools. So please do get in contact with him. Ian, do you have any final words before we wrap up?
It's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, we're recording this early in the morning. Yeah, I'm sure this early that you wouldn't have expected to hear those words, but welcome to my life. Uh, it has been a pleasure, and I just want to thank anyone that's listening to this because even by doing a little bit of RSC, you're making such a difference to young people. And so thank you very much, and I hope to hear from people soon.
Thank you, Ian. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm sure our listeners and watchers will find it incredibly useful. And yes, it is early in the morning, so let's go and get a nap in or something.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, Ian.